interest, hoping the woman would just hurry up and leave. "Are you not curious to know what is happening?" Charlie was silent for a moment, but she finally raised one eyebrow in silent query. "Himself is writing a letter," the old prostitute announced grandly, as if throwing crumbs to the starving masses. "It is for your husband, Lord Radcliffe. He is telling him that we have you, and that if he wishes to see you again, he is to come here, alone, unarmed, at midnight." "And then what happens?" Charlie asked, with a feigned calm that made the old whore arch an eyebrow. "Why, then himself kills him, and heads to Gretna Green to marry you." Charlie gave a bark of laughter, shaking her head with an amusement that was only half feigned. "Oh, that will work. I am sure no one will comment on that. Radcliffe dead, and me on my way to be remarried within moments. No one would suspect that myself or Norwich or both of us had done it. Good Lord, he is insane, especially if he thinks I would marry the man who killed my husband." "Oh, you will," Aggie assured her smugly. "You will, if you do not wish him to kill your sister as well." When Charlie blanched at the threat, Aggie grinned nastily. "Well, finally some reaction. Is that not interesting, though? The idea of Radcliffe's death leaves you stone-faced, while the thought of your sister's death worries you greatly. Does your husband realize that you care so little for him?" When Charlie did not respond, annoyance flickered over Aggie's face before she turned to the door. "Well, I must get back to work. I have a business to run, you know." Opening the door, she paused and glanced back to add, "You will enjoy marriage to Norwich. If Maisie is to be believed, he is an incredibly vigorous lover. A bit rough, perhaps, but vigorous just the same." Charlie watched the door close behind the woman, then gave the tray of food a shove that sent it crashing to the floor. "Oh, my!" Stokes bit his lip and turned away as Lady Elizabeth's eyes widened on her first sight of Lord Radcliffe. This was no time for levity. He lectured himself firmly. There was nothing the least bit amusing about the situation. Still, the sight of his lordship bewigged and gowned in Mrs. Hartshare's frilly pink dress was really more than a good valet should have to see. Even helping him into the ridiculous outfit had been beyond the call of duty. Stokes had a new respect for the women employed as ladies' maids. Truly, their chore in dressing their mistresses was atrocious. There were zoners and bone corsets, with laces that Lady Elizabeth had assured him had to be drawn tight, tighter and tighter still, despite the fact that his lordship had been woozy from the constriction. Petticoats and day sleeves, buffins and cuffs, stockings and garters, and that had just been the underthings. Then had come the outer, a stomacher, a bodice with its hook-and-eye fastenings, a waistcoat and skirt. And with all of that, his lordship still looked like himself in a dress, the servant thought with disgust. It seemed that the dress did not make the woman. Lady Elizabeth managed a rather forced smile and backed toward the door. "I shall return directly." Radcliffe glanced toward Stokes with a scowl. She did not look pleased. "Oh, I am sure she is pleased, my lord," Stokes murmured quickly, afraid the man was simply looking for an excuse to get out of the dress. It had taken Lady Elizabeth a solid hour of talking to convince him that he would have a better chance of rescuing Lady Charlie as a woman than as himself. Then the problem of a dress came into play. Lady Elizabeth and Lady Charlie were shorter than his lordship by a good 10 inches, as was Lady Bessie. Mrs. Hartshare, on the other hand, was only an inch or two shorter than his lordship. She was also full-figured and round, and while his lordship was lean and well-muscled, he was wide in the shoulders and had need of the extra space in the bodice of the gown. "Here we are." Lady Elizabeth rushed back into the master bedroom, powder, rouge, coal liner, and lip colour in one hand, and a mob-cap, bergère straw hat, and hooded mantle in the other. Dropping the clothing on the end of the bed, she urged Radcliffe to sit in a chair and close his eyes, then set to work. "Do stop scowling, my lord. You are causing lines in your powder," she muttered several moments later. "Surely you are done now," was Radcliffe's answer. "Nearly," she murmured, adding more colour to his cheeks, then stepped back and peered at him critically, tilting her head first one way, then the other, then the first way again. Her shoulders fell slightly. He looked even worse now than he had before. He looked like Radcliffe in wig, face powder, and a dress. "Perhaps the hat, my lady," Stokes suggested encouragingly. "Oh, aye." Relief obvious on her face, she whirled back to the bed to grab the rest of the gear she had brought in. Moving back, she set the mob cap over his wig, then added the straw hat, setting it at a jaunty angle, then changed her mind and tilted it forward so that it shadowed his face. Then further still. Stepping back, she frowned over him, dissatisfied, until Stokes gave a cough, drawing her attention. When she glanced his way, he gestured toward his own chest behind Radcliffe's back. It took her a moment to read his signals, and then her eyes slid back to Radcliffe's flat chest. Of course, that was why he looked so odd. She glanced around the room, then spied the hose lying on the floor, and scooped them up. "Here." Moving to stand before Radcliffe, she began stuffing the hose down his top, arranging and pushing the material until she had to give it up as a lost cause. She supposed there were quite a few women who had not been in line when God had handed out upper endowments. Tugging the material out, she tossed it aside and took the mantle Stokes now held out, arranging it around Radcliffe's shoulders, pulling it forward to hide his lackluster chest, then tugging the voluminous hood of the cape up to cover his head and hang over half of his face. "Are you quite through?" Beth sighed unhappily, but nodded and stepped back. Lord Radcliffe was off the chair at once and striding toward the door. Beth followed quickly, trailing him down the stairs and throwing the women warning looks over his head as Mrs. Hartshire and Betty turned to see them descending. Catching the warning, both women managed to contain their humour and merely watched, wide-eyed, as his lordship stomped down the steps in the tight, frilly, too-short dress. He was at the door to the street when he paused and tugged his skirts up slightly to peer at his feet. Turning back to face them, he frowned. "Shoes?" Lady Elizabeth glanced down with distress at his strong masculine legs amongst so many pink frills, and released a choked sound. Whirling away, she fled to the salon. Stokes hurried after her. He thought her distress was over the fact that there certainly would not be one pair of ladies' slippers or even clogs in the house that would fit his lordship. But when he entered the room, far from finding her crying, as he had feared, he discovered her laughing into the back of the settee, her entire body shaking with the effort to do so silently. "'Tis all right," Radcliffe cried, hurrying into the salon after them. "I shall just wear my jack-boots. No one will see them under my skirts." When Lady Elizabeth's shoulders began to shake even more furiously at that, Stokes promptly positioned his body to hide hers as he turned to face Radcliffe. He barely managed to maintain his solemn demeanour as he nodded in what he hoped would be taken as agreement, then sagged with relief as the Earl of Radcliffe hurried out of the room in search of the boots. Turning back to his mistress's sister, he found her recovering from her lack of decorum and wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "He will be noticed at once," she sighed, her humour gone, as if it had never been. "Aye, but mayhap not recognised." "We must hope not." "He has a better chance dressed so than as himself," Stokes said solemnly. "Mayhap we can just persuade him to try to keep his back to anyone he encounters, and to slouch a little, so that he does not appear so large." "Aye," she sighed, getting to her feet. "I am ready." Radcliffe stomped into the room, then, his jack-boots peeking out from under the pink skirts with every step. "Come, we have wasted enough time." Skirts flying, he whirled to lead the way out of the room. Chapter 21. "That is the room they kept me in, if you will recall, my lord," Bessie murmured, pointing at a window on the second floor of the building as the driver directed the carriage down the alley beside Aggie's establishment. "They are probably keeping her in there. From what I heard while I was there, that room is kept for the express purpose of holding unwilling guests." Radcliffe shook his head. "Nay, she cannot be there, Bessie, else she would have just crawled out the window, as the two of you did that night." "If she was able," Elizabeth murmured with a frown. When he blanched at her words, she quickly added, "They may have tied her up or something, my lord." "Oh, aye." Relaxing the teensiest fraction, he suddenly yanked his skirt up to check to be sure that his pistol was still in the pocket sack that hung under the petticoats, then quickly tugged it back down with irritation when he saw the women blush and turn away. It was beyond him why women wore what they did. He was laced in so tightly that he could hardly breathe, and weighted down with so much material he could hardly move. Women were a lot stronger than men gave them credit for. Unfortunately, most of that strength appeared to be wasted on carting about their clothes. "How are you going to get in?" Stokes asked anxiously. "I shall try the windows first, I think," Radcliffe said with a frown as he straightened out his skirts. "I fear using the front door would be too much of a risk." "Aye," Stokes said then. "My lord, your purpose may be better served did you try to, keep your face turned away from anyone you encounter." "Aye," Elizabeth agreed encouragingly. "And mayhap, if you tried not to look quite so tall, you might be able to avoid some unwanted attention. And if anyone does approach and question you, you might merely cover your face with a handkerchief and titter." Radcliffe blinked at that suggestion from Bessie. "I do not have a handkerchief." "Oh." Whipping one from her sleeve, Beth handed it to him as he got out of the carriage. "Good luck, my lord. I know you shall save her." "Titter," Radcliffe muttered as he pushed the window open on the first empty room he found on the main floor. "What the devil is a titter? And how the hell am I supposed to try not to look so large?" Shaking his head with disgust, he held the window open with one hand as he sat on the ledge, then swung one leg after the other over the sill and into the room. Standing, he let the window slide closed, then took a moment to brush the wrinkles out of his skirt and yank at the bottom of his bodice to straighten it before hurrying across the room. Pausing at the door, he pressed an ear to it to listen briefly, then eased it open and peered out. It was early afternoon, and yet it seemed the women were all still abed. Slipping into the hallway, he pulled the door gently closed and hurried as quickly as a man could in a dress that kept catching at his boot spurs toward the stairs. He had just set foot on the first step when a door farther down the hall opened. Cursing under his breath, he rushed silently up the stairs. "Aggie!" Radcliffe froze on the fifth step at the shout from below. The voice was a man's, and it sounded vaguely familiar. Trying to place it in his mind, he continued up the stairs more warily until he heard the madame's voice answer from the back of the house. "Aye? Send me little Willie. The letter is ready to go to Radcliffe." Standing on the stairs, Radcliffe hesitated. He still could not place the voice below, and that annoyed him. But what had made him stop was a sudden thought that he could confront the villain right now and have done with it. His gaze moved up the last few steps to the hallway that stretched out before him, however, and he frowned. He really should rescue Charlie first. Once she was safely away from here, he could tend to the man below. If he tried ere seeing her safe and something happened, he would never forgive himself. Nodding to himself, he continued quickly up the stairs and along the hall to the room Bessie and Charlie had climbed out of so many nights ago. Reaching for the door handle, he twisted it carefully, not really surprised when it turned easily. Had they locked Charlie in this room, she simply would have climbed out the window, as she had when she rescued Bessie. Still, he pushed the door open and peered about to be sure she was not tied to a chair or something. The drapes were closed, casting the room in deep shadow, but from the light spilling through the doorway around him, he did not think that there were any bound and gagged figures in the room. He hesitated, then sighed and slid inside, pushing the door half-closed behind him as he hurried to the windows and yanked the drapes open. Light now filled every corner of the room, and still there was no sign of Charlie. Sighing, he turned back to peer out the window at the alley below, a frown tugging at his brow. He saw at once that he was in the wrong room. The window Charlie and Bessie had climbed out of was the next one over from the one he was at. Muttering under his breath, He reached up to grab the edges of the drapes, snapping them shut again, just as the door squeaked farther open behind him and a voice called softly, "Darley?" Ratcliffe swallowed a curse at that low rumble behind him and went completely still, hoping that the dim light from the hallway did not reach him where he stood by the now closed drapes. No such luck, he realized as the man spoke again, sounding closer. "I did not think you would be back until later. Lord Ascombe usually keeps you through the night, and well into the next when he hires your services. If anyone does approach and question you, you might merely cover your face with a handkerchief and titter." Bessie's words sounded in his head, and Radcliffe frowned. How did one titter? What was a titter? The word made him think of high, twittering sounds. He did not think that he could manage something like that. Then the man pressed against his ruffled backside and rumbled, "Willie's missed ya." Willie? Radcliffe's eyes widened incredulously. This was little Willie. Good Lord, he had thought the little part had referred to Willie being a child. He should have known better. This was a brothel, after all. It probably referred to the size of his— Radcliffe's thought died as the man slid his hands around his waist and began to slide them up towards his non-existent bosom. That was too much for Radcliffe. He was not about to stand around being groped by a fellow named Little Willie. Tugging sharply away, he whirled to face the fellow, prepared to do battle, but the size of Little Willie brought him up short. The man was half a head taller than Radcliffe, and at least twice as wide. At least he looked that large in the dimness of the room. He also was not hampered by a woman's skirt, Radcliffe thought gloomily, preparing to be soundly trounced. Fortunately, it was dark enough in the room that Little Willie could not make out Radcliffe's features. At least that was what he assumed when, rather than rear back in outrage at recognizing him for a man, Little Willie took on a pouting air. "Oh, now, darling, don't be like that. You always return from Lord Ascombe's in a huff, and I know he don't use you right, but I'll be gentle as always, and help ye forget." On that note, the man tugged Radcliffe firmly into his embrace, ignoring his sudden struggles as he buried his face in his neck and slid his arms around him. Radcliffe was too shocked at the situation at first to react, but when the man's beefy hand slid down to cup his buttocks through his skirts and squeeze, he suddenly found the ability to titter. At least, the choked sound that slid from his lips sounded like a titter to him. Or perhaps a twitter. "Little Willie!" Having been just about to plough his fist into the face of the man before him in a desperate bid for freedom, Radcliffe nearly thanked God aloud for that timely call up the stairway. Little Willie suddenly stiffened, then heaved a resigned sigh as the shout came again, more impatiently this time. "I'd best go ere he wakes up the rest of the house," the man rumbled unhappily. "No doubt he's just wanting to be sure that I sent his letter with the stable lad. But he won't leave off till I tell him so myself." Giving Radcliffe's pink-clad bottom a friendly squeeze that made him jump and bite his tongue to keep back the curses on the tip of his tongue, the man pulled away, mumbling, "You're losing weight, darling. Your bottom's tight as a drum. You need to eat more. I'll bring you a little snack when I come back. Then I'll have to examine you real close to see where else you've lost weight," he murmured playfully, moving toward the door. "The hell you will," Radcliffe muttered, as soon as the door closed behind the other man. Hurrying forward, he opened the door a crack to see Little Willie lumbering down the stairs. The man was a giant. His fists were nearly as large as his head, which was admittedly small for his body. Radcliffe supposed he should be grateful that those fists had only squeezed his behind. Had the man hit him with one of them, he probably would have killed him with the first blow. Radcliffe sighed at his own thoughts. Dresses, he decided, were hard on a man's ego. They affected his confidence poorly. Any other time he would have thought the man was large, but slow on his feet, and that he could easily have outwitted him. In the dress, all he could think was that he would trip himself up with his own skirts and be lucky to survive. He had to find Charlie, get her out of there, and get the damn thing off. Then he would lecture his wife soundly on never, ever getting herself in such a dangerous predicament again. For all the good that would do. Sighing, he eased out into the hallway and closed the door. He had never found himself in situations like this before Charlie had sauntered into his life. He groused to himself as he headed toward the next room. Ah, well, at least he would never need fear his life becoming boring. Charlie would see to that, and without even trying, he suspected. Pausing at the next door along the hall, he checked the knob to see if it turned, a frisson of excitement running up his spine when it did not. She must be in there. "Charlie," he whispered. "Are you in there? Charlie? Can you hear me?" "Jeremy." Her heart leaping, Charlie rushed to the door, pressing her face against it eagerly. "Jeremy, is that you?" "Aye. Are you all right? They have not hurt you?" "Nay, I am all right." Radcliffe glanced around to be sure he was alone, then hissed. "Why have you not escaped out the window, then? Are you tied up?" "Nay, I am not tied up, but they have nailed the window shut. I have been trying to pry the nails out with a candle holder, but it is going very slow," she admitted with vexation, then sighed. "I take it you found the letter after all." "Aye." "How did you get in without being seen?" "I came in a window downstairs." "Thank you," she breathed through the door. "Thank you," he murmured with confusion. "For caring enough to come and try to save me," she explained. "But now you must leave. At once," she ordered firmly. "Norwich will kill you if you're caught." "Norwich?" he scowled, now understanding why he had thought the voice below sounded familiar. "Aye, he was the blackmailer, but this last message was merely to get you here, so that he might kill you." "Kill me? Why the devil should he wish to do a thing like that?" Her voice was sad yet anxious. "It is a long story, my lord. Suffice it to say that he is insane." She sighed again through the door, then insisted. "Please, my lord, you must leave at once. He really will not hesitate to kill you." "I'm not leaving you here." "Well, you cannot get me out. The door is locked and the window nailed shut. Breaking through either way would create enough noise to bring the household running. Unless you brought an army with you, I really suggest you leave right now." "An army?" Radcliffe murmured, thinking of Stokes, Bessie, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Hartshare, and her children in the carriage below. They had all insisted on coming, and not wishing to waste the time on arguing, Radcliffe had agreed so long as they all stayed in the carriage. "Radcliffe." "Aye?" He glanced at the door. Her voice had seemed to come from much lower along the door this time. "What are you wearing?" His gaze shot down to the keyhole, and he knelt swiftly to see her eye peering out. She had a beautiful eye, he thought now. It was odd that he had forgotten that. Both her eyes were beautiful, large, usually twinkling with some inner amusement, and a deep coal-black colour that looked like a starry night. "Hello," he murmured huskily. "Are you wearing something pink, with ruffles?" she squawked in disbelief, knocking him squarely out of his gentle musings on her beauty. Scowling, he stood abruptly. "It was your sister's idea." "Beth! Beth put you in pink ruffles." "It is a disguise," he managed to state with great dignity. "She thought that I might be able to avoid detection longer as a woman than as myself." "It is a dress," she squawked. "You are wearing a frilly pink dress." "It is a disguise," Radcliffe snapped, then frowned at the muffled chuckle that came through the door. "Now you know why I was the one who came up with the plans," she laughed. Then, before he could respond, sighed. "You do care for me, then?" "What?" He knelt at the keyhole again, peering in at her one eye. "What do you mean, I care for you?" "Well, that is the only reason a man might be persuaded to don a dress, to save someone he cares for." "That is tripe. Good Lord, woman, I chased you clear across England and into Scotland in an airless little trap with Stokes, Thomas, Beth, Mrs. Hartshare, and her children, yet that does not impress you with my feelings. I put on one stupid frilly dress, and suddenly you think I might care for you. I do not care for you, madame. I would not dress so for someone I cared for. I love you." "You do?" "Of course I do. Why do you think I married you?" "To save me from Carland." "I could have simply bought your uncle off. or sent you to the Americas to achieve that end," he said with disgust. "Tying myself down to you for the rest of my life was not necessary."
"But the morning after we,
she said at last, for want of a better word,
you told me you did not love me."
"You were not even awake when I left you."
"When you thought I was Charles,"
she explained. He was silent for a moment, then said, "I recall your asking about love, and my starting to say that I did not think it an important consideration at that point, but stopped to consider my feelings. I was very confused at that time. I had feelings for Charles that I thought wholly inappropriate, and feelings for Beth sometimes, but not others. It was not until I learned of the switching you and your sister were doing that I sorted everything out and realized that all of my feelings were for you."
"Then you do love me."
"Would I be kneeling on the floor in pink ruffles if I did not?"
"Oh, Jeremy, I love you too," she sighed, tears pooling in the one eye he could see. "I wish I could hold you."
"You will," he said firmly. "I will get you out of there, but first I have to—"
"Darling?"
Radcliffe stiffened at the low rumble and turned to stare over his shoulder at the giant standing over him. He had not heard the man approach. "Here now, darling." Radcliffe saw the fist coming down toward his head like a hammer, but didn't have a chance to duck out of the way before pain exploded in his head and unconsciousness overtook him. It was cold water splashing in his face that dragged him back to reality. Swimming up through the swirling fog in his brain, Radcliffe blinked his eyes open, closed them, then opened them again to squint at the blurry images around him, attempting with difficulty to bring them into focus. Charlie was the first thing he saw, or Charles, he supposed, taking in her breeches and waistcoat, as well as the fact that she was seated on the floor, cradling his head in her lap. Then he saw that she was glaring at the second blur furiously, and he squinted at it until it shaped itself into Norwich, who stood above them. An empty pitcher was dangling from one of the man's hands. "Finally!" the other man sighed impatiently. "Really, the two of you are quite tiresome. First she shows up instead of you, then you come early. I told you midnight. Can neither of you read? Nice frock, by the way," he sneered, turning to stomp toward the door. "You have a little over 6 hours until midnight. Enjoy them. They shall be the last you have together."
"Bastard,"
Charlie hissed as the door closed behind him, then turned to look down at Radcliffe with concern.
"Are you all right?"
"Aye," Radcliffe sighed, sitting up with her help and peering around, his hand moving automatically to rub his aching temple.
"Mayhap you should stay lying down for a bit,"
Charlie murmured anxiously, but he shook his head and forced himself to his feet, where he swayed woozily. "I do not have that luxury. I have to figure out a way to get us out of here."
"I shall do that. You just rest," she insisted, taking his arm to steady him.
"Nay,
Damn it, Radcliffe. I am wearing the breeches now. Sit down before you fall down," she snapped.
"You are wearing the breeches? What the devil is that supposed to mean?"
"Whatever you want it to. Now just sit down." Charlie gave her husband a gentle push that made him drop weakly onto the floor of the bed, then moved to the windows to inspect her handiwork from earlier. She had been working on one of the nails with a silver candlestick holder when Radcliffe had knocked at the door and called out her name.
"What are you doing?"
Glancing around, she saw that Radcliffe had stumbled weakly over to join her, and now stood swaying like a sapling in a stiff breeze beside her. Frowning, she took his arm and urged him back to the bed. "Will you just sit down and let me deal with this? I have enough to worry about without having to keep you from falling on your face."
"I will not fall on my face," he snapped, irritably, shrugging her hand off. "And I am your husband. You do not order me about."
"Is that right? Well, I have news for you, Radcliffe. You are not my husband."
"I am so."
"Are not? You married Beth."
"She may have stood in for you, but it is your name on the register."
"But not my signature. We are not married." He was stumped briefly by that, then scowled.
"Well, we shall rectify that situation. The moment we are out of here, I will arrange a proper wedding."
"Good for you." Be sure and send me an invitation. I will see if I cannot show up to witness it." He stared at her in bewilderment, wondering whether the injury to his head had not done more damage than he had initially thought. "What is going on? The last thing I recall before being knocked out was our admitting our love for each other. Yet now you seem to be saying you will not marry me. What did I miss here?" Sighing in frustration, Charlie rubbed her hands over her face wearily and shook her head as she crossed back to the window. "You have not missed anything. I missed it. I love you, Radcliffe, but I am not sure that I wish to spend the rest of my life with a man who treats me like an inferior." "I would never treat you like an inferior." "Well, you certainly do not treat me like an equal any more." "Oh, that is nonsense." "It is not nonsense. Ever since you found out that I was not really a Charles, you have been treating me like some sort of hothouse flower that does not have a thought in her head and might expire from the effort should I try to place one in it." "I have not," he denied hotly. "Oh, really? Well, when was the last time that you discussed business with me?" "It is not polite to discuss business in mixed company. Besides, women cannot understand the intricacies of—" His voice trailed away, his face flushing with guilt as he realized what he was saying. "Funny that I seem to understand it well enough as Charles, but am not even good enough to discuss it as Charlotte." "I had not realized," he began faintly, dropping to sit on the bed with dismay. "What? That you saw women as lacking? That you have been treating me like a tickle-brained jolthead?" she asked dryly, then moved to pick up a candelabra and positioned herself beside the door. Before Radcliffe could ask her what she was about, she let out a blood-curdling scream and raised the holder over her head as a key jiggled in the lock. The door flew open, a wide-eyed little Willie stepped in, and she brought the heavy holder down on his head with enough gusto that Radcliffe half suspected that she was working out some of her anger at him on the poor man's skull. When the behemoth crumbled to the floor in a heap, she tossed the holder aside, bent to snatch the keys from his limp hand, then straightened to eye Radcliffe impatiently. "Well, are you coming, or had you intended to wait there for midnight?" Closing his gaping mouth, Radcliffe got quickly to his feet and stumbled forward. The moment he had stepped through the door, she pulled it closed and locked it, then pocketed the keys and hurried toward the stairs. They were halfway down them when Norwich appeared at the bottom, much to Radcliffe's amazement. Charlie continued down even as Norwich stepped back and raised his gun to await them. At the bottom of the stairs, Radcliffe moved quickly to place himself protectively before his not quite legally married wife and faced the man. Norwich frowned at him with annoyance as he raised his gun and aimed it, then said, "I do not know what is the matter with you two. Why can you not simply do as you are told? Things would be so much easier if you did so." "Oh, yes, that would be nice, would it not?" Charlie snapped over Radcliffe's shoulder. "Then you could give nice little orders like die, and we would just drop at your feet." Norwich frowned at her, then raised an eyebrow at Radcliffe. "Sassy little thing, is she not?" "I prefer to think of her as passionate." Norwich's eyebrow rose further. "Really? Well, I can hardly wait to experience her full passion." "Not in this lifetime, Norwich," Radcliffe snarled. "He is right," Charlie said calmly, when the man chuckled derisively at the threat. "I am afraid the game is up. Your plan never would have worked in any case. Radcliffe and I are not even really married. Beth is the one who married him in Gretna Green." "Your sister married Mowbray?" "Aye. 4 days prior to our arrival in Gretna Green, she married Tomas. Then the morning your men rode into Gretna with us, she dressed up as Charles and married Radcliffe. It was not a legal marriage. If you kill Radcliffe, all you will get from marrying me are a couple of paltry jewels. Most of them have been sold and the money invested." When he started to shake his head with patent disbelief, she shrugged. "If you do not believe me, ask Beth. She is standing right behind you." He laughed openly at that. "If you expect me to believe—" His voice died as something hard poked him in his lower back. "Well, hello, Lord Norwich. Fancy meeting you here." Beth trilled cheerfully, then nudged him a little harder in the ribs with her weapon. "You will give up your gun to Lord Radcliffe, will you not?" Radcliffe took the pistol as it suddenly hung limply in the other man's hand. Beth waited just long enough for him to point the weapon at the villain, then rushed around him to hug her sister. "I did it, Charlie! I saved you! I saved you! And I did it with a candlestick!" She half laughed and half gasped, pulling away to hold up her weapon. "Oh, it was marvellous! What a rush of sensation! I have never felt so frightened or so truly alive. Do you know, I do not think I shall ever be afraid of anyone again," she said, then laughed and hugged her again. "I did it!" "Aye, you did," Charlie smiled at her widely. "Where are the others?" "Right here, my lady," Stokes said, pushing a bound and gagged Aggie down the hallway toward them, with Bessie and Mrs. Hartshare following. "But how did you know they were all here?" Beth asked Charlie in amazement. "I saw you all climb out of the carriage and crawl through the first-floor window from the room upstairs," Charlie explained. "I was trying to decide at that point whether 'twould be better to block the door, break the window, and climb out, or lure little Willie into the room, knock him out, and risk the stairs. Seeing you come in made me decide to try the stairs. I hoped you would arrive in time to help with Norwich." "And I did!" Beth's face was as bright as a candle flame with pride, and Charlie could not help but laugh. "Aye, you did. You were marvellous." "I was I not?" she marvelled breathlessly. "Aye, and I never again want to hear you say you are a coward. It took great courage to face him down with naught but a candlestick. You could have been killed. Why, all he had to do was glance over his shoulder and— Beth?" Reaching out quickly, she caught her twin as Beth crumpled to the floor in a dead faint. Chapter 22. "What time is it?" "You have asked that question 20 times, Radcliffe," Thomas pointed out with exasperation as he checked his timepiece once again. "'Tis 4 minutes after the hour." "They are late." "Women are always late. I do not know why you are worrying yourself so." "I am not worried." Radcliffe grimaced at that. "You are already married. Whether you go through with this service again today or not, you will still be married to Beth. Charlie and I are another matter entirely. But the two of you sorted it out. She has agreed to marry you, has she not?" "Aye." He looked slightly hardened, but then worry crept across his face again. "But what if something has happened?" "Something like what?" Thomas asked, curiously. "Who can say with Charlie? She attracts trouble like no woman I have ever known." "True," Thomas agreed, morosely, worry plucking at his own brow now as well. "And Beth has taken on that rather unfortunate trait herself lately, ever since that incident with Norwich, in fact." Radcliffe nodded solemnly. It was true. The once quiet and sensible Beth had become more like Charlie, thrusting herself into the path of injustice at every turn and making her husband crazy with it. Much to Radcliffe's amusement, the Mowbray home, too, now sported an array of waifs and strays she had rescued from one predicament or another, though he would never reveal his secret amusement to his friend. And Thomas was correct in saying that it all harked back to the incident with Norwich, and her disarming the man with naught but a candlestick. It seemed her words of that day had been true. Despite the feint that had followed the incident, she truly was no longer afraid of anyone. As for Norwich himself, the last they had seen of the man was when the authorities had taken him and Aggie away. He had been squawking that he was the son of a king at the time. What had happened to him since was anyone's guess. Aggie had suffered a heart attack in prison and had not survived to stand trial, and when Radcliffe had made inquiries about the prosecution of Norwich, he had been told not to worry. The matter had been handled. He had heard various rumours, but suspected that the man had been locked away in Bedlam, where he could cause no further embarrassment to the royal family. "Damn!" Thomas muttered suddenly, drawing Radcliffe from his thoughts. "Now I am worried too." Exchanging gloomy glances, the two men began pacing the front of the church under the watchful eye of the minister and the 400 restless guests cramped into the church. Every single member of the ton had wanted to be present at this renewal of vows between Charlie and Radcliffe and Beth and Thomas. They all thought it terribly romantic. Of course, None of them realized that it would be the first time Charlie would get to say her vows, and that their earlier marriage might not be quite legal. Charlie had insisted on it being 1 year to the day after their supposed marriage at Gretna Green, just so that there would be no confusion over wedding anniversaries. Beth and Thomas had understood and agreed to the date. Of course, that had been before they had learned that Charlie was pregnant, and that her due date was just a week after the date set for this renewal of vows. Radcliffe had tried to convince her that they should push up the wedding date. There was no way he wanted the child born prior to the wedding, and possibly being a bastard because of it. Still, Charlie, charming, exciting, sweet, stubborn Charlie, had said nay. They would continue as planned, and hope the baby did not come early. "How did you convince her to remarry you?" Thomas asked, curiously, drawing Radcliffe from his thoughts. Making a face, he admitted, "I had to draw up a contract stating that I would never again condescend to her, that I would discuss business with her on a daily basis, were she interested, and, he sighed unhappily, and that I would take her to my club, dressed as a man." Thomas gave a start. "What? Shh!" Radcliffe cautioned, glancing nervously around to be sure that they had not been overheard. No one seemed to be paying attention to them. Most of the guests were casting expectant glances toward the back of the church, hoping to spot the brides, who should have been there by now. Glancing back to Thomas, he nodded. She was quite adamant about seeing the club. It seemed she was jealous of Beth's getting within those hallowed halls. Her words, not mine, and she was determined to see inside for herself. "Have you taken her there yet?" Nay. I managed to put her off for quite some time, and then by the time she lost her patience with my stalling, she was with child, and did not think the smoky atmosphere would be good for the baby. I am hoping by the time it is born, and she is up and about again, she will have forgotten." A faint shriek from outside the church made him pause and stiffen in alarm. That sounded like Charlie. Turning, he hurried toward the back of the church with Thomas on his heel. Crashing through the church doors, they both froze at the top of the steps and gaped at the spectacle taking place on the street below. Charlie and Beth, in all their wedding finery, were in the midst of attacking what appeared to be a street vendor. Flowers were flying through the air as they both pummeled the man with their bouquets and shouted at him furiously. "Have I mentioned, Radcliffe, how little I appreciate the effect your wife has had on mine?" Thomas murmured suddenly, and Radcliffe glanced at him with amazement. "My wife? Good Lord, Thomas, you cannot blame Beth's sudden change on Charlie. They grew up together, for God's sake. After 20 years of influence, she was not like this." Thomas frowned. "I had not thought of that." "What do you suppose did it, then?" Radcliffe grinned slightly. "The only new thing in her life is you." Thomas was gaping over that truth when Stokes slipped out of the church to join them. "Oh dear, Lady Charlie and Lady Beth are hardly in the condition for that sort of behaviour." Radcliffe and Thomas glanced back to the activity in the street. The man had turned away, it seemed, and tried to climb up on the bench seat of a wagon, only to have one of the women launch herself at his back. She appeared to be attempting to climb him like a mountain, and despite her advanced state of pregnancy, was doing a bang-up job of it. Meantime, the other bride was now stomping on his toes, kicking him in the shins, and yanking his hair for all she was worth. The vendor was squealing like a pig. Both men started forward at once, grim determination on their faces. Radcliffe went automatically for the woman on the man's back, unhooking her from the vendor and carrying her several steps away to set her down. When she turned to face him, he blinked in surprise. "Elizabeth!" "You are letting him go! Stop him!" Beth cried, running forward, even as Charlie slipped from Tom's grasp and rushed toward the man. Cursing in unison, Radcliffe and Thomas hurried forward, latching onto their wives' arms and urging them away before grabbing the vendor by his arms as he tried to climb into his wagon once more. Dragging him back to the ground, they turned him about to face the panting women. "Now," Radcliffe frowned over the women's dishevelled and breathless state. "What is going on?" "He was beating that child," Charlie gasped furiously, reaching up to straighten her veil. "What child?" Thomas frowned, and his wife answered, "The boy in the back of the wagon." Leaving the vendor where he was, both men moved to the wagon to peer in at the child cowering there. There was no mistaking the marks he bore as anything but bruises from a vicious beating. Radcliffe reached in to lift the child off the filthy strips of leather he lay on. "Here now, put him back. He's mine." The vendor rushed forward. Radcliffe arched a brow coldly. "Yours?" "My nephew. I got him when his parents died. I'm apprenticing him, teaching him to be a cobbler, and he's mine to deal with as I see fit. Besides, he deserved the beating. He done gone and run off on me. Of course I beat him when I spotted him here and caught him back." "I would run off too if you beat me," Charlie snapped. "Not all those bruises are new." Radcliffe and Tom peered from each other to the face of the miserable child Radcliffe held. The boy was thin, too thin. Bruises old and new decorated his pale skin, and he had a hopeless expression on his face that no child should have. Shifting impatiently, Radcliffe glanced at the cobbler. "I will buy him from you." "Radcliffe!" Charlie gasped in horror. "You cannot buy a child." "Aye, he can," the cobbler said quickly. "How much?" "We shall discuss that in the office of my solicitor tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. While Charlie listened grimly, he gave the address to the man, then handed the child to Stokes, took Charlie's elbow and started them up the steps to the church. They were halfway up before he realized that Charlie was being unexpectedly quiet. Glancing at her narrowly, he frowned at her tight-lipped expression. "Are you all right?" "Aye," she said quickly, pressing her hand to her burgeoning stomach. "You are not." He paused on the steps as she bit her lip in pain. "You are, aren't you?" "It will wait until after the wedding," she said determinedly, taking another shaky step. "Charlie, are you going into labour?" Beth asked anxiously as she and Thomas joined them on the steps, her own gown burgeoning with the girth of a child. She was only a month behind her sister in her pregnancy. It did seem the twins liked to do things together. "You are, aren't you? Mayhap we should delay." She fell silent as Charlie turned on her furiously. "This child will not be born until his parents are properly wed." Radcliffe was torn for a moment. Then, cursing, he swept her up in his arms and hurried up the stairs with her, leaving the others to follow. "He's all right, husband. You can set me down. I think that the pains have stopped," Charlie murmured as he pushed his way through the church doors with her. When Radcliffe ignored her and strode purposely up the aisle of the crowded church, Charlie forced a smile for the benefit of the guests, who had turned as one and were now watching their approach wide-eyed. "Here we are," she called out in feigned cheerfulness. "Sorry for the delay." "Get to it, father," Radcliffe said grimly, pausing before the gaping man. "Set me down," Charlie hissed, and after a hesitation Radcliffe did so, setting her on her feet just as Thomas, Beth, Stokes, and the cobbler's boy reached their side. "Father!" Radcliffe snapped impatiently, and the man gave a start, then cleared his throat and began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." "We all know why we are gathered, father. Please, get to the important bit." "Now see here, young man," he began, then glanced worriedly at Charlie as she suddenly gasped and clutched her stomach. "Are you all right, my lady?" "She is about to have a baby, father. Perhaps we could get this over with before it comes." "Well, I know she is having a—" "You mean now?" The horror on his face knew no bounds. "Then you must get her home, see her comfortable, and—" His voice died on a choked sound as Radcliffe grabbed him by his vestments and eyed him menacingly. "Marry us first." When the poor man nodded quickly, Radcliffe released him and put a comforting arm around Charlie. Not that she noticed. Holding her stomach, she had begun to pant in a worrisome way. "Do you, Lord Radcliffe, take—" "I do," he snapped, and the minister frowned at him. "At least, let me finish," he paused and swallowed as Charlie released a sudden groan, pain on her expressive face. "Oh, dear Lord," he breathed, then straightened grimly. "All right. Lord Radcliffe takes Lady Radcliffe, and my lady, do you take him too?" When she nodded, he glanced toward Tom and Beth. "Lord Mulberry, do you take Lady Mulberry, and Lady Mulberry, what about you?" They nodded as one and murmured, "We do."
Good. Then, what is next? Sweat appearing on his brow, he floundered briefly, then cried, The rings! Put them on! Once Thomas and Radcliffe had slipped the rings on their wives' fingers, he sighed with relief. That is it. You are man and wife. Again. Now, kiss them and be gone. Kissing Charlie on the forehead, Radcliffe bent to catch her up in his arms, then turned and hurried down the aisle with her, Thomas and Beth hurrying behind them. Radcliffe, Thomas, and Stokes were pacing ruts into the salon floor when they heard the coughing squall of a baby's cry. The clock on the mantel read 5 minutes to midnight. They had been pacing for more than 12 hours. On arriving at the townhouse, Beth had had Radcliffe carry Charlie upstairs to their room, then relegated him and Thomas to the salon. Stokes had returned from the church shortly afterward with the cobbler's nephew, Mrs. Hartshare, her children, and Charlie's new lady's maid, Maggie, all in Mulberry's carriage. Leaving the children in Stokes' care, Mrs. Hartshare and Maggie had hurried upstairs to see what assistance they could offer, and that was the last the men had seen of any of them except for the occasional sight of one woman or another flying past the door of the salon on her way to fetch this or that. At least Stokes at first had had tending to the children to distract him, but then they had been put to bed, and he had joined his master and Thomas in the salon to accompany them in their pacing. Now hearing the cry from above, the 3 men eyed each other with a combination of relief and trepidation. Relief because it was obvious from the child's lusty cry that he was healthy, but trepidation because now they must await news of the mother's condition. For Radcliffe the wait was interminable. Charlie's screams had reached them clear down into the salon, and everyone had torn at his heart like the claws of a lion. A half-hour passed like a year as the men stood still, their pacing over as they stared at the stairs, through the open salon door, waiting. Then Thomas murmured, "What do you suppose is taking so long?" The question was enough to snap Radcliffe's patience. Muttering a curse, he stormed out of the salon. Thomas and Stokes glanced at each other, then moved as one to follow him up the stairs. Beth had just finished remaking the bed and was helping Charlie settle back into it when the pounding started on the door. Mrs. Hartshare answered it, and Charlie heard Radcliffe's determined voice quite clearly. "I want to see my wife." Mrs. Hartshare stepped aside at once, allowing him to enter before closing the door on the anxious gazes of Thomas and Stokes. "Charlie?" Radcliffe hurried forward, then paused uncertainly at the side of the bed when he saw her. She looked exhausted, her face pale, hair dishevelled and lank, and her eyes and expression incredibly weary as she glanced from the baby in her arms to him. She had never looked more lovely to Radcliffe, and he told her so as he eased carefully onto the side of the bed, one hand moving to cover hers on the baby, and squeezed gently. Charlie made a face at the claim, knowing just how bad she must look, then smiled slightly. "Do you not wish to see your son, my lord?" "Son?" He peered down blankly at the bundle she held. "He's a boy." "Aye. Would you like to hold him?" Radcliffe looked doubtful, but took the small baby. Holding him awkwardly and feeling incredibly clumsy, he peered down at the child and felt something tighten in his chest. He looked oddly like a little old man. His eyes were squeezed closed, his head nearly bald, except for a fine feathering of fuzz. His face all squinched up in displeasure, and an angry red from the ordeal he had suffered, and he was flailing one chubby little fist about. He was the ugliest little thing Radcliffe had ever seen, and the most adorable. "He is so tiny," he marvelled, feeling tears well in his eyes. He and Charlie had made this miraculous new life. "You would not say that, my lord, had he squeezed his way out of you," Charlie muttered, with asperity. And her husband looked briefly stricken, then saw the amusement dancing in her eyes and smiled. "Actually, he is not small at all," Beth murmured, moving to join them. "For a baby, he is quite large, in fact, larger than any of the babies I saw born at Westerly." "Beth has always had an interest in healing," Charlie explained when Radcliffe looked curious. "Back at home, if there was a body that was ill or a birth taking place, Beth was usually there to try to help. Shall I take the baby out to show Thomas and Stokes, so the 2 of you can have a moment alone?" "Aye, please." Radcliffe handed the child over to his aunt, then glanced around. The other women had already finished what they were doing and slipped out of the room. He waited until Beth closed the door silently behind her, then turned back to Charlie, bent forward and kissed her gently on the lips. "Thank you," he breathed into her hair as he hugged her carefully. "You are welcome, my lord," she sighed, leaning into his embrace. "What for?" "For our child." "I seem to recall your having had a hand in that," she murmured with amusement as she pulled back to lean against the pillows, then heaved a sigh and grimaced. "I am sorry for today, my lord." His eyebrows rose. "For what?" "For ruining our wedding. I did not mean to, but when I saw that cobbler beating that boy—" "You could not help yourself." "Aye." She bit her lip. "I could not simply turn my head and ignore it." "And I would not want you to," he assured her gently, and she raised her eyes to meet his gaze. "Truly?" "Truly. Your compassion for the weak and disgust for injustice are two of the things I love most about you. Though," he added wryly as she relaxed, "I am grateful that in your condition you were not the one to jump on the man's back, as you did with the farmer over the pups. I was quite relieved when I pulled who I thought was you off the cobbler's back, and found it was Beth." "I was attempting some restraint," she said with dignity. "It is something I am learning from you." "Then we are each learning from the other, for I have been learning to live again from you," he murmured, and realized that it was true. Even his guilt had left him. Charlie had told him all that she had learned of Mary and Robert's murder from Norwich as soon as they were safely home that night. Learning this news had removed a world of guilt from him. There was nothing he could have done to save his sister. Even had he convinced them to take the carriage, an armed guard or an army, Norwich would have killed them another day. He could not have protected her from him. Even Robert could not have. None of them had suspected his intentions. He'd been quite mad. "I am so happy and content just now, Radcliffe," Charlie murmured suddenly, and Radcliffe smiled and stretched out on the bed beside her, holding her gently. "So am I, my love." She was silent for a moment, then asked, "Radcliffe, would you really not change me for the world?" "Not a bit," he assured her solemnly. "Beth says there was no tearing, and I should be up and about in no time. You know what that means, do you not?" Radcliffe blinked at what he thought to be a change of subject, but tried to follow it gamely. "What does it mean, my love?" "It means we can go to your club soon." "Oh, Charlie," Radcliffe groaned, then started to laugh as he hugged her. "I should have known you would not forget about that." "Oh, come now, Radcliffe. It will be exciting." "Oh, aye, it will be exciting, all right," he agreed wryly. "Especially when someone recognizes you as Charles, and knows Charles is really Lady Radcliffe, and I am thrown out of my club. That will be most exciting." "That will not happen. Beth and I have devised a disguise we are sure will work." "A disguise, he murmured doubtfully, his gaze fixing on the excited gleam in her eyes. "Aye. And just think of it, husband. Me in my tight breeches, you the only one knowing 'tis I." Her eyebrows waggled suggestively. "Mayhap we could find a room or a closet unoccupied and—" She shrugged slightly as her voice trailed away, and Radcliffe wasn't surprised to feel excitement stirring within him. It seemed like forever since they had made love, though it had only been the last week or so that they had stopped for fear of hurting the child. Her suggestion now was raising a great deal of interest in him. Only Charlie would consider the possibility of making love under the noses of the ton. "When did Beth say she thought you might be up to that sort of thing?" he asked in a growl, and Charlie beamed at him brightly. "I always knew you had the soul of an adventurer, my lord." This is Fiona Hardingham. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of The Switch by Lynsay Sands. This program was produced by Dion Audio Services. The director was Bob Dion. Executive Producer, Karen Chakonsky. Text copyright 1999 by Lynsay Sands. Production copyright